The year is 1814. A quarter century of intermittent conflict has seemingly come to a close with the defeat of Napoleon. In November, the great powers would hold a peace conference known as the Congress of Vienna to discuss the peace terms and the new national boundaries that would remain mostly unchanged for the next century. Briefly interrupted by the return of Napoleon in 1815, the final act was signed by the participants on the 9th of June, 1815. Less than 10 days before Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo. The results of this Congress would set the stage for the coming century, effectively creating the powder keg which would explode 100 years later in the form of the First World War. In this episode of Lighting the Powder Keg, we'll be taking a close look at why and how the Congress of Vienna set the stage for the tragedy in Europe. The early 19th century had been filled with revolution and conflict. The upper classes looked on in horror as France descended into chaos, with many of the ruling class killed or tortured at the hands of the revolutionaries, with the final culmination of such turmoil ending in the ascension of Napoleon and the subsequent destruction that swept Europe afterward. The ruling class was adamant not to let it happen again. One particular individual would go on to become the main architect that would almost single-handedly create this concert of Europe. This man was Clemens Von Metenek. Born in 1773 to a diplomat, he would quickly gain more influence throughout the Napoleonic Wars. He continually worked to preserve the Austrian monarchy, at times to the detriment of the Habsburg Empire or Europe in general. Between 1810 and 1814, he would quickly jump from actively opposing France, becoming a French ally, taking a stance of neutrality, and then finally war with France again. After the Austrian defeat at the Battle of Wagram in 1809, Metternich took on the task of orchestrating a peace that would save the Austrian monarchy, no matter the cost. At the end of the negotiations, Austria had given up most of its western holdings, and its influence over Poland. Although more had originally been demanded by Napoleon, Metternich had successfully orchestrated a marriage between the French Emperor and the Duchess Mary Louise, instead of the Tsar's youngest sister, Anna Pavlovna. This resulted in an unstable alliance between France and Austria, which would eventually break down as the French army rapidly deteriorated in 1812 after the failed invasion of Russia, eventually resulting in the resumption of the previous war in 1813. When the Congress of Vienna began assembling in the autumn of 1814, Metternich found himself once again in a prominent position, becoming the de facto moderator between the powers and holding enough influence to decide which post-war powers would hold the most representation. His goals were mainly centered around keeping Austria and the Habsburg monarchy at the forefront of European politics, to solidify their place in the world and stabilize the shaken empire. Metternich had come to the conclusion that further war in Europe ran the risk of igniting more revolution, and set about making sure Europe would enter an era of relative peace and stability. His belief in the necessity of European peace for social stability were shared by the representatives from the 4 other major nations taking part in the Congress as well: Russia, Britain, Prussia, and France. However, there was still the ever-prevalent vying for power between the nations of the coalition, which brought them close to the brink of war on multiple occasions. Even still, the main goal was to create a system that would allow for European powers to settle their differences peacefully, and work together to halt the spread of revolution and the liberal ideas of democracy the ruling class saw as dangerous to their way of life. When the Congress began, many of the Big Five, Austria, Russia, Prussia, Britain, and France, had very specific goals that, in many ways, conflicted with each other, and ran the risk of sending Europe into another conflict before Napoleon was even completely defeated at Waterloo. Specifically, 2 things became areas of high tensions: effectively stalling the Congress until they could be resolved, and creating rifts between the nations that would resurface in later years. These were the claims on Saxony and Poland. Tsar Alexander of Russia had laid claim to the Kingdom of Poland and wanted to incorporate the formerly Napoleonic territory completely into the Russian Empire. This included the region of central Poland and the western region of Posen. At the same time, Prussia laid claim to the Kingdom of Saxony, the entire kingdom, justifying the claim by pointing out that the Saxons had sided with Napoleon throughout the recent war. While the claim out in Saxony merely threatened Austrian influence in Germany, the Russian claim on Poland was far more controversial amongst the nations, leading to France, Britain, and Austria forming a secret alliance against Russia and Prussia, vowing to go to war if Russia went forward with the total annexation of the Kingdom of Poland. Using this threat of war as a bargaining chip, Metternich successfully mediated a compromise in which Tsar Alexander would become the King of Poland, while Prussia gained the Polish region of Posen and only the western part of the Kingdom of Saxony. Thanks to this compromise, it kept Russia and Prussia content while protecting Austrian interests in Europe and British colonial goals in India by keeping the Russians from getting too powerful. Metternich, still wanting to further secure Austrian dominance within Europe and curbing Prussian growth, went about setting up a replacement to the Holy Roman Empire that had been dissolved in 1806. It would consist of 39 states, presided over by the Austrian Empire as a de facto president of sorts. The plan to create a confederation of German states in order to halt Prussian influence within Central Europe would ultimately backfire in 1848. However, it did successfully stall Prussian expansion for some years. Another major agreement was the unification of the Netherlands and the southern Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, into one unified state. This would only last about 20 years and result in the modern nations of Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, with all the different repercussions that have come along with them since. But that's a story for another day. One of the last major changes made by the Congress was the changes in Italy. Austrian policy in the northeast of the peninsula, through its acquisition of Lombardy Venetia, fanned the flames of Italian nationalism, coupled with the centralization of the various Italian states to stabilize them after the defeat of Napoleon. This would end up having some serious consequences for the Austrians in just a few short decades. At the end of the Congress, Austrian hegemony over mainland Europe seemed to be uncontested. Yet Prussian influence over Germany was only growing, and Russia quickly turned its attention towards the south in its never-ending goal for a warm water port. France had been relegated to a second-rate power, leaving only Britain as a possible contender for a European mediator. By the 9th of June, 1815, most of the European powers had signed the final act, with the exception of Spain, which would ratify it in 1819, but this had little consequences. They weren't seen as a major power. The groundwork laid by the Congress of Vienna would almost completely freeze the previously common border changes between nations, and usher in an era in which massive European war was unthinkable. The Concert of Europe was a careful and methodical dance between the various powers in Europe trying to make gains while simultaneously not allowing the stability within society to fracture beyond the breaking point. At the core of it all was the Holy Alliance between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, their goal being to put down any rebellion that threatened their hegemony, or the stability of the continent. Anything that was seen as a threat to the elite aristocrats was dealt with harshly by these nations, and insurrections were quickly put down. This was the foundational principle of the Concert of Europe. Although over the years, the way in which this was achieved would change, from a singular alliance to two opposing and changing alliance blocks. Over the course of the 19th century, fractures within the Concert of Europe would start to form, and various events would put major strains on the nations of Europe that would culminate in the eventual explosion that was the First World War. The stage has been set for tragedy. Now it's time to watch how the fuse was laid, eventually lighting the powder keg of Europe. Thank you for watching this first episode of Lighting the Powder Keg. The next episode will go over the early tests of the Holy Alliance and one of the most tense parts of its history, the Greek War for Independence. Special thank you to my Patreon backers for supporting my channel, and huge thank you to my brother for composing the epic intro music to this series. If you'd like to see more, please consider subscribing to my channel, and please be sure to share your thoughts or feedback with me in the comments below. You can keep up with me through my Discord or Instagram, and if you want to support what I'm doing, you can check out my Teespring shop and my Patreon linked in the description below.